Welcome, everybody. Welcome. This is a very special moment, and I want to provide a little bit of context as I introduced Brother Bayo, and then also frame today's conversation. Um, there's so much that I want to share. I'll first share that our the Garrison Institute Fellowship is entering a particular point in its history, a history that's short because we just launched it last year, but a history that has been very strong in terms of the scope of work that we've taken on over the last 8 months. We have 11 wonderful fellows, many of whom are here and will be joining us in the conversation. And behind the scenes, we met each month for about 4 to 5 hours and supported each fellow with their scholarship, with their thinking, with their inquiry, with their even social emotional development to ensure that they are part of the next generation of contemplative leaders and compassionate leaders. That is the central goal of the fellowship. And the theory of change around the fellowship is grounded on 4 pillars: generative action, collective healing, the science of interconnection, and there's one more that will come to me in a moment. And one of the things you want to know is that each month we've engaged a powerhouse of a speaker, a teacher. My colleague Adam Horowitz is here. He was one of our guest teachers. Bayo came by. Bayo stopped by and we sat with Bayo. We had a deep conversation with Dr. Daniel Siegel. We had a deep conversation with Otto Scharmer. We had a deep conversation with Ari Melenciano, who is an incredible technologist, bringing an Afrofuturist theory with Black feminist thought and contemporary critical theory. So all that to say that this forum marks the culmination of a series of conversations within the fellowship that have burst open our conceptions of what does it mean to engage in contemplative scholarship, in conversation about planetary health, in conversations about contemplative-based resilience. And we really, really resonated with Dr. Bayo's work. And actually, the last pillar that I forgot just a moment ago is awareness-based contemplative wisdom. Awareness-based contemplative wisdom. So today we are going to be spoiled, rotten, in the sense that, from my perspective, Dr. Bayo represents not just the field of psychology, as he'll tell you, he's a recovering psychologist, but also West African cosmology in terms of his roots in the Yoruba tradition, but also his deep commitment to fugitivity, always kind of rubbing up against the edge of what we know and feeling very comfortable walking the tightrope of uncertainty. So on some levels, I gravitate towards him precisely because of how uncomfortable he makes me. And so today we'll be wrestling with Bayo. The title is kind of a misnomer. It says wrestling with post-activism, which we will, but really we'll be wrestling with Bayo. And what I'll do is I'm gonna wrestle with him a little bit. I can't do it for too long because I may lose a limb, but I'm gonna wrestle with him a little bit, and then I'm gonna invite our fellows to join the circle, and we'll support them with wrestling with Bayo a little bit, and then we want to create the space for all of you to be able to engage him, and then also for us to engage you. The last thing I'll say before I just check in with Bayo is that I think that what he represents and what scholars in his tradition represent is, on the one hand, the touch of wisdom that is channeled through them, that is evident in terms of his voice and his scholarship. But I think the radical nature of the accessibility to him, very important, because as scholars get more and more well-known, they actually become higher and higher up in the ivory tower, or whatever tower you want to name, and they're harder to actually engage. So just want to just acknowledge you, Brother Bayo, and welcome you. I know you're in Chennai, and I know that you're recovering from COVID. Your family was deeply impacted. Just want to honor you. How are you doing? How are you arriving today?
I'm good and ready to rumble. Mm-hmm. Is that the phrase?
It is. It is.
Okay. I'm fine, brother, and thank you for that masterful introduction to the Institute. And I greet you all over the world. I'm in India, and true to my brother's words, we've been wrestling with this more than human entity of the virus. And so, but I'm glad to be here, not with my usual support system since I'm in isolation, but I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to speak and fight with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ding, 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 ding. let's go right into this notion of post-activism, brother. I think that when we began to articulate it with the general audience, I think some folks gave a double take because of just the lack of understanding of what that is. But you coined that term several years ago, and I know it's part of a long tradition of posts, postmodernism, post-qualitative research, post. But I think that conception is really powerful. So could you just really lay that foundation for how do you define that term so that we can begin our match?
Well, the post in post-activism is queer. Mm-hmm. By the way, can you all hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? You can hear me good? Great. The post in post-activism is queer. It's doing more than just, what the other hyphenated words are doing in, for instance, postmodernism or post-qualitative research. It's signaling something else. When I coined the term post-activism, the full name of the word or the full terminology was actually compost activism. Yeah, so I shortened it to post-activism. So the post there is duplicitous. It's post signaling this invitation to move away from a notion of agency that situates responsibility, centrality, power, control in the human figure. And also it's compost activism, which is a more radical invitation to fall apart, which is a Harawaian notion of the human as humus, that we are processual, relational beings. We are not as well put together as we think we are. And so, to speak about post-activism, one must speak with it through the lenses of fugitivity. That is, I do not think that I would ever arrive at a static definition. There's something ecstatic, right? I like the word ecstasy, ecstatic. That's outside of stasis, outside of being defined, outside of categorization. There's something desirous and ecstatic and moving and fugitive about the concept of post-activism. But if I were to introduce it to someone, it would be this very epic and planetary and also intimate notion that we can no longer speak about agency, responsibility, accountability, change, justice, transformation in the ways that we've spoken about it. Why? Because the world has changed. And not because, some people come to me and say, oh, I like, this idea of post-activism, I'm trying to be post-activist, not activist. And I get the sense that they think that post-activism is a superior form of activism.
Mm.
Like there is a realm of acting and being that is just one ontological decibel, above mere activism.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to say that activism itself can no longer be seen in the ways that we've seen it.
Mm.
We tend to see ourselves as the drivers of change.
Mm.
But now we now live in a world, as a result of the topographical shifts, the pedagogical contributions, insights from indigenous cosmologies, we're now at a convergence point, and we can no longer see ourselves as the center of the room, right?
Mm.
We now have to account for furniture, for microbial worlds, for ancients, for ghosts and ghastly becomings, for archetypal longings, for force fields, for principalities and powers, for climatic longings. We now have to think ecologically.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not Angel that's doing all the magical stuff. It's not Walter Davis. It's not Suzanne Lacey or Emma Jalode, doing all the magical stuff. I just like naming people, you see, just the way of bringing you and myself into the room. It's not us now. It's now a web, a rhizomatic web of being. So post-activism is, in a sense, the stretching of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
The invitation to lose our way and build wilder coalitions of acting with the planet.
Mm. Give everybody an opportunity to sit with that for a moment. The invitation to get lost. And this notion of post-composting as well, and the reality around the pandemic and the more than human world. Sometimes I think that if our planet had sent us a memo through COVID,
Mm-hmm.
How many of us will actually listen?
Mm-hmm.
So my next thought, brother, is I do want folks to really appreciate just how much you hold in not just the oral tradition and in formal traditions like psychology, but also philosophy. Your work also, you mentioned, I think, Karen Barad, and this is the notion of the new materialism.
Yeah.
Just like post-activism could be kind of a new foreign concept for some folks. I think it'd be good for people to understand the lineage you come from in terms of new materialism and postmodernism. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I draw from so many sources, and I like to say to people that the teachers that you revere, the people you respect, always ask for references. Always seek references. We are all connected in a deep line, or not a line is too linear, a deep web of contributions. No one has it all together, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely thank you for that beautiful invitation to reference the breasts that I draw milk from, the grounds that keep me standing. I'll start with the Yoruba tradition, and I'm Yoruba from Nigeria, which is in West Africa. Some of us may have been to Africa, or some of us may have gone. Monique, have you been to Nigeria? Have you?
Oh, but it's on my bucket list. And I did
It's
trace my lineage. I did trace part of my lineage there. So, yes.
good. Excellent. Excellent. You're welcome. Nigeria is, the largest conglomeration of black bodies on planet Earth, this side of the solar system, I think. Um, there might be a planet black somewhere, but
Wakanda.
but this Wakanda, we have it in for Wakanda, but that's another story. And the Yoruba people are this beautiful, festive, celebratory, rich culture that is not just limited to Nigeria, but spreads into neighboring countries as well, like the Republic of Benin, But the spiritual heart of the Yoruba people is said to be Ile Ife, where the Yoruba people came down, or the Orishas, which are super deities or superhuman deities, descended from the heavens and started to build the planet. But to cut the story short, at the heart of the Yoruba cosmology, or one of the many hearts of the Yoruba cosmology, is the notion of Ashe. You might have seen people say Ashe, 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 Ashe. It's an increasingly popular form of greeting, just like Namaste and the head wobble, which I'm getting used to because I'm married to an Indian. Ashe is more than just amen or so be it, even though it's colloquially used in that light. Ashe is the understanding that agency is scandalous, that the power to do stuff is not limited to one entity. It's not a property of any one being. It's a crossroad event. And so we think of crossroads, the notion of the crossroad is called Orita in Yoruba, and it's loosely translated crossroads, but it's such a poor translation. Orita means the place where the three roads meet, and the number 3 is poetically resonant in Yoruba culture because the number 3 is associated with the trickster, and the trickster, whose name is Eshu. Eshu is said to have traveled, for instance, with the slaves across the Atlantic. He's the one that travels. He, she, I might say, he, she, it. Pronouns don't fit him or her or it, right? Whatever you choose is fine. So Eshu is said to be the man who sits at the crossroads, and he is the one that holds Ashe, basically. So Ashe is this very planetary, ecological, rhizomatic, tentacular idea or concept that no one holds agency. We don't have power. Power is not a thing to be had. Power is a streaming libidinal flow that enlists bodies into its mattering, right? So you don't have power, I don't have power. You know, it's not that power can be had, it's that power has us, right? And we are invited into spaces of capacity or incapacitation, as the case may be. When I read this notion of Ashe and related constructs that I'm working with, like Abayomi, and you know, other constructs that I might share with you here, and I read it through this emergent academic scholarly tradition of the new materialist discussions. Now, new materialism is this rejection of human centrality. Basically, it's the story that we've given in the words of Karen Barad, who is a very dear friend of mine, a mentor, collaborated with me in the writing of my first book. She's a professor, quantum physicist, and a feminist scholar at UCSC. She says that we've given language too much power. You know, we've given discourse too much power. We've given words too much power. Why does she notice that? It's because Western scholarship has historically centralized language, discourse, analysis. What they are, the hidden curriculum of that centrality is that we are, as the owners of language, humans as the owners of language. When I say we here, I specifically mean humans. Not that I count myself as a member of the human race. I'm trying to exclude myself. Another story. But that we've given language too much power means that we've cut out the world and its own contributions to how things come to be, right? We tend to think, for instance, if we want to solve climate change, we need to call a climate change conference together. And so we gather around, Angel and I, you know, and Monique and Jessica and Walter, we call this huge conference together and we come up with a manifesto. And then we write our blueprint. We call it the Greener New Deal. I'm just riffing here. This is greener, you know, than any is green, the real deep green New Deal. And And then we plan it out. Now, what's working here behind this presumption that we can gather forces together and solve things? It's this idea that humans are transcendent, that we are not part of the fray, you see. We are, there's just something about us that means we're above the planet. We don't need to confer with trees or mountains or stones. We are floating above the realm. In fact, the world has no meaning beyond that which we give it. There's some kind of phallic configuration here where we impute meaning upon the world. The world outside of us has no meaning. And this is signaled in that ancient psychological question taught to every undergraduate in psychology, which I sometimes propagated, but try to queer. The question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, will it make a sound? My answer to that question might be different today. So it's this idea, this structuralist, and I don't want to go into the philosophy of structuralism and all of that, but these philosophies, continental, Western in orientation, have privileged human beings as the owners of agency, as the principles of the planet, right? We're dominant species for a reason. And it has cut out the fact that we are actually indebted to microbes, to zombie bacteria, to sea stars, to winds, to diatoms sailing across the Sahara Desert, across the Atlantic Ocean, and giving us oxygen. We've cut out the material contributions of the world, the promiscuous, scandalous gifts of the planet. So that's new materialism. New materialism is not a monolithic enterprise. It's just, disparate philosophies can encamp themselves within this large tent. But I think at the heart of new materialism is the idea that humans are not in the center of the room. So when I read these ideas together, new materialism, post-humanism, which I will speak about eventually, it brings me to this place of post-activism. It invites me to get lost, to not be so sure of myself and my status, and to seek other ways of being in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. So appreciate that just framing, and just to note a couple things around new materialism and postmodern and some of the insights that have come from that, and some of the ways that quantum physics ends up kind of in that milieu, that it's almost not a new discovery, but actually a reinforcing and a return of older ways of understanding the world. So just acknowledging some of the ways that in your tradition, like the Yoruba tradition and many other traditions, had already a sense of that truth. That kernel. And then I'll just say that I remember speaking to some indigenous elders from, I believe the Lakota Sioux Nation, around talking about agency, and they said two things. One was that, like, even knowledge itself has agents, like, so that what the insight that comes up for us today as we're listening to Bayo, every single morsel has an agential capacity. It's coming up and surfacing for a particular reason, and can activate your will, can activate your sense of action in the world. So just wanted to kind of slow us down a little bit to really absorb what Bayo's saying around that we are not just the only ones in the room and the only ones with agential power. And then the second thing is in terms of the role of relationality and relationship. And then in many indigenous communities, like, we are relationship. Like, the whole world is relationship. It's not just me, but a whole web of things that construct me in this moment. And in light of that, I want to invite some fellows to join me here. So the fellows that are in the room, would you raise your hand? All of you who are in the room and want to join the conversation, could you please just raise your hand, and Monique will bring you into the circle. Could you raise your hand on Nico and Nicole? I think, I'm not sure if Barnaby's here. any fellow, Casey, my sister, Jennifer Bloomberg, I know she has to leave, but Jennifer, if you want to jump in the circle, please join us. Hey, Jackie and Nico, Nicole, these are the precious beings we've been holding for the last year, and really want to create the space for them to. We may have others who will join us. Selma, so Monique, would you bring Selma and Barnaby in here? I think Casey may have transitioned. So my role as a director is to get us into good trouble and put the fellows in situations where they can grow. So this is on some level a steel sharpening steel situation where I'm going to step back for a moment and hold the space from a distance and let you all wrestle a little bit with Bayo. And then we'll have a couple rounds of this, and then we'll shift to the audience so that we can have a larger kind of epic battle. I want to invite Nico. Nico, him and I have been talking about this for a while, and then we'll have Nicole, and then we can organically see what comes up for Jackie, Barnaby, and Selma. Brother Nico.
Wow. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you, Angel. Hi, everybody. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And hi, Dr. Bayo, Brother Bayo. It's so good to see you again. Yeah. Sending a lot of love your way for
Thank you, bro.
You and your family. Yeah. So we got time, right, Angel? Got a little bit of time. I can move slow.
Yeah, you take your time.
All right, right off. So I was, as I was listening to you two talk and trying to think of a way to describe what your work has meant for me, what it means to me, and the kind of impact it's had, a story came to mind, a quick story that I want to share. You may have, so for all you jazz enthusiasts, you may have heard this before, you too, Bayo. There's a famous story though about John Coltrane and Miles Davis. You know this one, right? Where Coltrane was in Miles Davis's band. At the beginning of his career, he was known for these really lengthy solos. Beautiful but super long. And when trying to rationalize to Miles why his solos were so long, he said, "I just can't figure out how to end it." And then Miles responded in his raspy Miles Davis voice. He was like, well, you might try taking the horn out your mouth. Yeah. I don't know if this makes sense to y'all, but engaging Bayo's work for me is the obvious immediacy of oh, I could just take the horn out my mouth, but it's also the reality bending invitation into a world, a territory of imaginal space that I just never knew existed. So it's an honor to be here and to be talking with you, Brother Bayo. Yeah. So and another way to say that is your work, your beingness in the, how you be in the world reveals the adjacent possibilities to what we sometimes talk about as progress, the unending continuity of the modern liberal project. So one of those reality bending questions that you've asked before, for me, that revealed an adjacent possibility was this question: what is whiteness becoming? What is whiteness becoming? So I was hoping we could shift the conversation a little bit to a reflection on whiteness and what that is from this more than human, I don't even want to call it perspective, this more than human possibility. I've heard you talk about whiteness as a planetary ethic, as an earth-shaping phenomenon that enlists different kinds of bodies into itself as a part of the way it gets expressed, which for me, kind of, it brings up that description. It like brings up the image of whiteness almost as like the highest concentration of fear and forgetfulness in a primal feedback loop, becoming ever more dense and getting articulated through the human mechanism, of thought, word, and action. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of expand a little bit on what you mean by whiteness as a planetary ethic, or this question, what is whiteness becoming? Where is that taking you? And then more specifically, I'm wondering what then is Blackness for you? Is Blackness also a planetary ethic? Does it enlist different kinds of bodies? What is Blackness becoming?
Nico, I've missed you. And, and I don't want to miss you this long anymore, okay? So
right on.
So let's keep on talking, and yeah, this just fills my heart and my muscles with strength and soul. And thank you for Miles Davis, for bringing Miles Davis Ghosts into the room. I think I want to strike at the heart of some presumptions about identity, and of course, whiteness here. Or let me, what I want to do is to speak to nature of nature. I think the contemporary conversations about change and returning to indigenous roots, and dismantling the modern liberalist or liberal humanist project, usually, and in my view, it's a mistake, usually frames nature as this harmonious realm. And in some philosophical texts, it's called revisionism, right? It frames nature as this, originary point. And the meta-narrative here is that everything started great. And then along the line, just like the biblical story of sin and its entrance into the world, along the line, things started to go crazy. And blame is allotted to the modern project, to modernity, to the intervention of colonial projects, right? So we started to think of ourselves as separate. And so within this narrative, the ethical invitation then is to return to when things were nice and good, right? Is to return to indigenous realities as they once were, right? The problem with this idea is that it frames nature as a thing. It reiterates this modern capture, which it's trying to extricate itself from by framing nature as a pure thing to return to, right? So let's go back to the land flowing with milk and honey. Let's go back to a pristine world where everything is harmonious. But our elders will say, that things have never been harmonious, right? There's always been strife and chaos and trouble. The moment you try to capture nature and make it the thing and level its ground, you're inadvertently expanding the boundaries and the borders of the modern project, even in your attempts to become indigenous, right? So I want to notice that. There, the irony of some of our attempts to extricate ourselves from modernity becomes an expansion of modernity, right? And this is what I notice here with our conversations about whiteness. Mind you, I come from a largely racially homogeneous society, not with a lot of diverse bodies, right? We're black, we're very black. See, notice, look at this. I'm like, Nico is right here in his blackness, Angel is maybe one rung above, but I'm the bottom of the rung. I was born in the dark, you see. So I'm blackety, blackety, black, black, black. And most people where I come from, in the world that I come from, are like me, right? So, and yet you might say, so what gives you the right to speak about whiteness? Because whiteness is the dominant narrative in this blackety black world. How, you might ask? Whiteness took the form of colonial departures, right? We raised our flag, we adopted the nationalist rhetoric, we became part of the global empire of nation states. We formed ourselves in the image of the future. We adopted the spirituality of progress. We decided to turn away from our languages. We established schools. We invited the World Bank. We established rooms for the World Health Organization. In other words, we became, even with our black skins, you know, in a Fanonian way, we became very white, right? So whiteness is not a thing limited to the United States or to the so-called New World or to the Americas or to Europe. It's a thing that we have to grapple with. And in my own personal grapplings and the contributions of elders and people that I deeply respect, there's a noticing that whiteness, in order to really meet it, you know, and there's no stable it to be met, I dare say, but in order to grapple with these decolonial urgencies, emergencies at the moment, we cannot risk framing whiteness as an alien, as an evil coming to the world, you know, using the trope of the Augustinian tradition of sinful natures. We cannot risk that. I cannot bring myself to say whiteness is an evil, because to say that is to relieve it of its entanglement with the rest of the world. To say whiteness is a bad thing and we should get rid of whiteness, and whiteness is known by white bodies who are properties of this evil entity called whiteness. To do that would be to remove whiteness, is to do the thing that I described earlier, is to propagate whiteness, right? Is to remove whiteness from its entanglements with the world, is to let it be ecstatic, or no, not ecstatic, static, is to let it be static instead of ecstatic like every other thing is. So the kind of scholastic, pardon me, my COVID brain is still recovering. The kind of scholarly and um, philosophical and communal moves we're making today is to bring whiteness down to earth, right? Is to notice that even whiteness, you're not as well put together as you think you are. You're not as separate as you think you are. You are connected with stone and mountain. It's just that you've done a very good job at shaving off all your tentacularities and pretending that you are not indebted to these other contributions, right? That's what modernity does best. It names things and it forgets the relationships that brought those names into being. You know, that's what modernity does well. So whiteness, I want to say, is also becoming, right? And there's something dangerous about saying that, you see, because it troubles contemporary moves to call white people or white identified people, or even the notion of whiteness into, to call it to question in this guise, or in this wise. Most or many contemporary activisms around racial justice, in trying to critique whiteness, make it a sinful thing, make it something that is inside the human, right? Something like some effluvious principle that I have to extricate out of your body. In doing that, it makes it, it reinforces whiteness as a separate entity. And what I'm trying to do here is to allow us to see that even whiteness is becoming, even identity is, you know, relationally, processually, extensively, multifacetally, multidimensionally attached to the world around it. So there's this scholar called Rosie Braidotti who speaks about nomadic subjectivities. Fancy word for the idea that we're all moving, right? We're all migrant. All of us are migrant. It may not be easy to notice that in New York, right? Migrancies are not, they're very difficult to notice in the city, right? But if you come from the world that I come from, if you've lived out some of the experiences of those migrants that travel with boats and very vulnerable and volatile vessels across the Mediterranean to get to Europe or some other part of the world that is more developed. If you've lived out these experiences, you notice that the world is in movement, right? The entire world is in movement. Angel is not a bundle of essences, essential entities. You are a relational product. You're constantly navigating, and this is in sociology as well. It's just that sociology and social constructivism doesn't go as far as I would want to. It doesn't do enough to notice how Angel is a coagulation, you know, of multiple beings, and you're a composite being all the way down. But none of these beings are entities, they're becomings, right? So it's within this large meta-narrative or framework that I'm able, Nico, to you, that I'm able to say that whiteness is a becoming, right? And so one of the moves we can make today is listen to what whiteness is becoming, because in that supposedly counterproductive or counter contemporary move, in that way of listening to whiteness as if it too was part of the world, I allow white identified bodies to move away from their self-blame, right? Which is not productive, which doesn't do me anything. Your feeling righteous or your feeling unrighteous does not advance my cause to be well on the planet. It doesn't help me at all. I don't want white allies. I don't want good white people. I want sensuous becomings, right? And it's the only way we can all travel together when we release ourselves from the carceral politics of whiteness as a stable or stabilized settlement. When we begin to notice its molecular, fugitivity, then we also can frame ethical ways of leaving the city behind. But so very briefly, and I know I've taken enough time on the whiteness question, Nico, with blackness, I see blackness as a planetary principle, right? That is an invitation to rupture, to cracks, to openings, right? There's something, and the Greeks spoke about it when they spoke about katabasis. I've spoken about it with the fellows before, I think. Katabasis being this idea of descending into the soil, of shape-shifting, right? I see it in multiple cultures. Not that I've conducted this vast anthropological study, but as much as I'm able to jump from here to there, I see it across cultures, in the Mediterranean, in Africa, even in Europe, that there's always been this archetypal longing to descend into the soil as part of our indebtedness, as part of a move of surrender, right? I think of that as blackness. Many people can say, or might say, by making blackness this invitation to rupture, am I not effacing the lived and practical and embodied experiences of Black folk, right? Am I not removing that away in a post-humanist longing to make everything about material worlds? I would say no. What I'm trying to do is to actually account for Black experiences, to say that we have gathered around white cities and white frameworks for so long that we need to do something different. And I think that thing that is different that we need to do is to listen, is to learn to listen, is to learn to listen to Awon Iyawa, as the Yoruba elders will call that, the more than human, effluvious, beautiful entities and movements and relationalities that we lose sight of because we situate whiteness as a place of power. Blackness has hitherto been a passenger concept. Just a trope of not quite human. And what that does is that it galvanizes our actions and our agencies to try to seek out a seat at the table. But I think, Nico, that there are other tables. In fact, there are other rooms. I don't want to clamor for a front row seat on the Titanic, especially in these times of Anthropocene. We need to become what Timothy Morton calls hypo-subjects. Not hyper-subjects, but hypo-subjects. That is beneath subjectivity. We need to go underground, right? And that is how you learn to listen to the favela in Brazil. That is how you might learn to listen to the slum in India. That is how you might learn to listen to the so-called abject places, the place of cracks and rupture where continuity is impossible. That is the invitation of Blackness to me, not a fight and struggle and antagonistic wrestling match to get a seat at the table. That is a form of capture already, but an invitation to depart, to go and exile, to seek other places of power. That is, this exilic principle is what I would call Blackness. Yes, to stop trying to get into Melia. Who did that? Who said that? Austin. Oh. Mayaburu is here. Yes, to stop trying to get into Melia. We need departure. Yes.
Right on. Wow. Okay. I'm gonna sit with that. A couple months. We'll get back up. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Can I drop one more question in here, Angel?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Might take me a little bit to land in the question, but we'll get there. I'll find it. So just taking in some of what you said in response to that first question, I want to pivot a little bit, but it's still related, the way it's all related. You know, whiteness and colonialism happen for me in the same breath and are deeply entangled with climate collapse, with what we talk about as climate collapse. Yeah. So you have a piece called "What Climate Collapse Asks of Us," right? And in that piece, you say, the world is not about to end. We are already living with a different world. We are already in the midst of loss and downfall. And then you go on to say, we cannot save the world from climate change because climate change is the world. Yeah. So again, it feels like you're inviting us into the more than human possibility, you know, which lands for me like, like I am being unfolded more than I am cause in the matter of my unfolding, you know, the way a single choice involves, like you said earlier, like an entire ecosystem of zombie bacterias and carbon cycles, you know, all of it. So, and this might need a little context around, you know, in terms of how you talk about progress, climate collapse, you know, that. But in eco-justice spaces, when we talk about climate collapse, there can often be an uninvestigated assumption that one of our main goals in climate work is survival. And that seems like something we can all agree on. But climate collapse occurring as a problem to be solved becomes a very different thing if survival isn't the goal. You know, if the unending continuity of progress, the modern liberal project isn't the organizing principle, right? If the colonial human subject isn't more than is more than just a self relegated to a flesh and bone body, right? So I'm not saying that the like self-annihilating logic of white modernity shouldn't be addressed, or that the ways in which humans don't correspond to the thriving of life shouldn't be tended to. But I find for me, when the attention is trained on survival, on staying alive, within a configuration of aliveness that doesn't allow for dying, what gets sacrificed, ironically, is a sense of aliveness, like and that lack of aliveness or presence, that disconnection, that not knowing how to end the solo, how to like take the horn out of your mouth, right? The limited territory of imaginal space is a big part of the engine that drives what we talk about as climate collapse, that drives my not contributing to the web of life, my not offering something back like a good friend might to the water and the plants and the animals that sustain me, or my not honoring those as relationships, as my relations. Yeah. So all of which is to get to this question, and it's still forming, but like, how do we fold dying as ecological, as a part of aliveness, into a conversation about climate collapse without scaring everybody, and maybe what does it mean for you personally to die wisely? What is dying well?
Thank you, brother. Beautiful, masterful framing. What does it mean to die well? I think I've written elsewhere that death needs a new ontology. But let me take a step back just and notice how words betray us. Just want to acknowledge how words do things other than what we assign them to do, right? It's just like the realization that our brains are actually doing other things. They have a side gig. You think it's your brain, but your brains are doing other things, embodied by other kinds of waves that are detected. They're engrossed in other kinds of activities. I think the same might be said about words. Right? We think we have it all together, and this is embodied by our linguistic strength. So if I'm able to marshal the meanings that I hope to convey, then I have the world together. My world is complete. So when the UN experts speak about sustainable development, right? Sustainable progress, it falls down like a pack of cards when you ask a question, what is being sustained here? What are you trying to sustain? It's just like speaking about a sustainable pregnancy, like no terminal point. What is being sustained? What are we trying to perpetuate? What are we colonizing? The innocence of the words, fall apart when we see that other dimensions and other imperatives and other algorithms and formulas are stowaways. They're packed into those concepts, sometimes escaping our conscious awareness. And this is what I hear in the word survival. So like you brilliantly said, brother, when you frame survival, I'm hearing other things as part of this survival quest, this quest to live on, right? And it's the perpetuation of our way of life. It's the idea that I want to keep on going to the groceries. I want to keep on choosing my, being in control of my flight plan to travel across the Atlantic, to visit any nation I want to. I want to be able to use Google and Facebook. There's so many things that are hidden behind the concept of survival that we do not get to notice and unpack them. Like you said, we don't, we stay with these concepts quite uncritically. And so this is where I would say that bodies do not precede the worlds that they inhabit. It's not that Nico lives outside or precedes capitalism, or there's, that there's a Nicole, there's an Angel, there's a Casey that is essential outside of the framings of the world that we inhabit. It's that our bodies cohere along with these worlds. So the way we speak about survival and life and death signals or perpetuates or is a fractal aspect of these larger systems. So you're right to call out and to speak about survival as maybe an ethical framework that risks repeating the kinds of politics, the kinds of troubling anthropocentric ideas that we're used to. In the world that I come from, death is not a terminal end of things. You know, that's why we say when you find many roads and you find one with an obstacle, go to the one with the obstacle, because it's the obstacle that makes you shape shift. It's the obstacle that gives you the opportunity to become finer, right? To become something different. And many cultures, not just African cultures, are replete with accounts of bodies transmutating into other kinds of bodies. But you see, modernity does not have the bandwidth to think about shapeshift in that way. It can think about it in some transfabulatory way, but it dismisses it as magic, as entertainment, right? As something Harry Potter-esque, not for the business as usual that we need to take care of. And so that's why we need a different story about death. That's why we need new, wilder coalitions. But the heart of your question, Nico, is how do we fold death into these contemplations? My response is, it's not up to us. It's not up to us to do that. Oh yes, with our beautiful words and language and stories, there are pedagogical openings that might instruct us in certain new directions that we must trace back to the movements in the world at large. I want to continually do that and disabuse our minds that we're acting unilaterally, that we can save the world unilaterally, that we can frame death unilaterally. It's only as a result of the movements in the stage that the actors can act in a different way. In the words of Karen Barad, the world is kicking back, you see? The world is kicking back. And so this kickback we receive is allowing us to say different things, to speak different things, to imagine different things. I do not know that we can unilaterally rethink the notion of death. I think that the conceptual freedoms allowed us by conversations such as this and the Anthropocene and the pandemic is giving us leeway to do so. But we must always account for the contributions of the world in making that possible. It's not going to be left to a manifesto. It's not going to be left to the Garrison Institute or to the Emergence Network to shift all of us. It's not going to happen that way. It's with the wrestling, which is why I really appreciate wrestling in the title of this convergence. It's in the wrestling together with these relationalities, these topographical shifts, that new entities and new possibilities and new imaginal futures will come forth. So this is a place of humility, really, right? We don't get to speak about entanglement and then, settle back into the control room and say, so how do we do this entanglement shit? How do we do this entanglement business? We don't get to do that. If you're to take entanglement seriously, then we have to take seriously the account or the story, the fact that we are not at the center of the room and it's not left to us to change. That might seem fatalistic to some of us. That might seem self-denying. And I don't mean to say that we don't have agency. In fact, I do mean to say we don't have agency. I don't mean to say that we are without agency. But I do mean to say that agency is always to be conceived as a witnessing principle, is something that is together with the world. So maybe the question for me that I'll pose back to you, brother, is who do we need to surrender to to live into different kinds of death practices. Death now becomes a practice, not an occasion, not a singular event. Who do we need to meet? You know, what relational beings, what parliament of voices do we need to sit with in order to practice death differently, right? Maybe we need to sit with psychedelic villages. Maybe we need to sit with nopales, you know, and mushrooms. Maybe we need to, you know, none of this is about changing the world, because you know, this is an announcement, a public service announcement. There is no coherent world as such, right? That is another linguistic convenience offered us by, you know, largely, especially in our context, by modernity. There isn't a world to change. There are only rhizomatic becomings and unbecomings, right? So our business is not to change everything. Our business is just to offer ourselves a glimpse of the otherwise, the small, almost insignificant opening in the plantation wall that allows us to touch fugitive futures. You know, our invitation is to that. So that is the way I respond to that.
Mm, 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 Thank you so much for that. Nico, please respond. Any last thoughts before we transition to Nicole?
Nope. just a thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, bro, for the question.
Mm-hmm.
Powerful. Let's have Nicole, then Casey, and then see where Selma and Barnaby and Jackie are, and then we'll wanna maybe take a couple of questions from the audience and then take a break. I see this as a marathon. So Nicole.
Hello, Dr. Bayo. Thank you so much for being with us today and sending so much love to you and your family. And I hope that you all recover very soon. I just love sitting with you and Nico, thank you for those wonderful questions and for engaging in conversation. Thank you, Angel, for your framing at the beginning. I'm gonna take this from a little bit where we left off. This idea of dying well and that death needs a new ontology. And this idea, what was coming up for me is this idea of grief and our ability to put walls up around the things that are uncomfortable, that can't be explained, that make us grieve, that make us uncomfortable. I was watching a nature documentary by David Attenborough about
who else?
Yeah, of course, right? He is the best.
He is.
It was a documentary that covered and followed different, you know, nature life forms and how they were able to come back and thrive at the beginning of the pandemic when everything was shut down. And I couldn't help but feeling this heavy grief and this heavy kind of feeling into knowing how we are impacting nature and impacting this world by merely coming at it with a human-centeredness, as you say, as that we need to kind of control and make sense of in ways where we are dissecting and identifying and coming up with names for things, and even just the ways that we show up in every moment in this world are really to try to take away the uncertainty and the grief and move away from that. In one of the podcasts I listened to with you, I was really struck by this idea of how you characterized leaves falling from trees and how is that maybe a representation of grief, and how can we respond to that? How can we be with that? And then the other thing that emerged for me was another thing you brought up in a different podcast about this when they were excavating to prepare for the Olympics in Brazil, that they discovered that they were building on top of this mass gravesite, and how really those cracks, those wounds, those spaces are just beneath the surface for all of us all of the time. But modernity tries to pave over, tries to make sense, tries to dissect, tries to kind of center humanness in a way that is really trying to shield us from and keep us from facing the grief and the separation that is there. I guess the last thing in framing this that I'll say is that one other phrase that comes up for me in regard to this is Dr. Dan Siegel, who is a huge inspiration for all of us. He has this phrase that the lie of the lethal separate self. And I feel like that is so pertinent and so important for us to be thinking about right now, and is woven into so much of what you're talking about, is how are we not able to be with our whole selves in this holistic way? How are we not able to be with humanity or beyond humanity? How are these definitions of who we are limiting what we can become? So I'll give you some specific questions here. What I'm wondering with all of this is, what are those cracks, those wounds, those dark spaces that we are unable to look at, those shadows per se that we are unable to look at, and how does this limit us, limit our definition of who we are, and how we show up and shape the world that we live in?
Thank you for beautiful memories there. The conceptualization of grief as an ecological network, right? It's a cybernetic network instead of just a human feeling, right? And there is a sense in which, there are so many things sparking, firing in my head, right? That I'm dragged to the work of Franz Brentano, who the old writer who gave us the phrase, or who worked on the concept of intentionality, right? And intentionality being this story that, agency is largely directional. You fix the conscious gaze. There's something phenomenological about this as well. You fix my intentional gaze on things, and that is the route through which agency enacts itself upon a largely passive world that receives our agency, right? And intentionality is too small, it's too tiny, it's too anorexic a space to account for the influences upon us, and how we're incapacitated and how we're rendered capable by the world. I think it's better to think of it as a field. And I mentioned Brentano and intentionality because I feel that we're doing many more things than we think we are. That there's so much more happening. We're way in. I had to coin a new word. Last year I called it diawhelm. Right? There's this sense of being overwhelmed, which creates this geometry of linear depths and stuff. But diawhelmed, it's diagonal. I imagine transversal arrows shot through us everywhere. We're spread out, we're diasporic. This idea that I fix my mind on doing something and I get a cup of coffee at Starbucks, and that's all that happened, really. That the world is to be reduced to actions, or is reducible to isolated actions and constructs, is a myth, is a fantasy of modernity. Right now, in sitting here, we might be enacting some old ancient protocol that microbes thought up in the in the Jurassic era or something as crazy as that, that we're not as well put or as isolated or as isolatable as we think we are. Now, this is where I mentioned that, all of that to bring us to this idea of grief, that I often think that grief and grieving, that when we build cities, we're grieving. That when we say, oh, that country is a shithole country and ours is not a shithole country, it's a Norway or a Norwegian type. Sorry, it still makes me laugh. I like Norwegian type people, and the shithole countries can go to hell. That there is a form of grief in that. That there is a sense in which architecture is part of grieving. Urban planning is part of grieving. That we might be grieving when we plan walls, or we're trying to push away the influence of grieving. We're trying to remove ourselves, like you said, from its influence, from its overwhelming influences, because we know what it does to us. It brings us back to earth. But your question really is not just about grieving, it's about cracks and openings, right? Because if we start to think about grief, not as a human event, but as an ecological matter and as an eco-psychological becoming that is not to be seen as good. Again, I'm not dealing with the narratives of it's good, it's bad. It can be dangerous, right? And that is why different cultures draw the line in different places, right? Yoruba people would allow a whole village to roll with a widow or a widower, a recently bereaved person, as a performance, as a practice of grieving, right? But no more than that, because grieving can actually take us away. And we have imperatives for how we want to be in the world at different times. Cracks, I think of that as the embarrassing excessiveness of the world, right? That this modernity is the algorithm of completion and categorical relationships, right? Nicole is, I don't know, but you present to me as Caucasian. So I'm just going to say, I don't know if you are Caucasian. Nicole is Caucasian and Bayo is African. That's modernity. And that's identity, which is part of the modern project. The embarrassing excessiveness of things, or what the Yoruba people call ashe, is signaled where we notice that you're not as Caucasian, you're not fully Caucasian, you're not fully anything you see, because even biologically speaking, if I were to trace your ancestry, you might be more African. You might be blacker than I am, you know, in some sense. And if I were to trace my ancestry, I might be more European, you know, than my sister Selma here, or more American than most of y'all. I'm just trying to say poetically, I think, that what I think of as the embarrassing excessiveness of things is what I think of as cracks. And cracks are not just shadows or dark places. They're the sites where continuity, progress, forward thinking, imagination about what comes next is rendered impossible, right? Where certainty is lost, right? And I'm thinking about the horrible fires in California and how it reduced visibility, where you could not see down the road, you could not see a few feet ahead. Situations like that, a crisis event, and these crisis events are more than we think they are. They're not just reported on MSNBC and CNN all the time. There are places where the place where the world holds together is loosened up just a little bit and something sprouts up. Karen Barad calls it a flashing up. It's messianic in its embodiment. Messianic, why? Because it provides an opportunity for bodies to become different. That is, for me, the way transformation happens. Not as a result of human ingenuity, not as a result of language or human agency, but as a result of excessive, embarrassing movements of things, cascading into each other and rendering the world incapable of becoming different. There's a word in the literature called cripistemologies. And cripistemologies refers to the idea that disability is not owned, is not a property. Disability is a network of capacity, right? For instance, one part of the literature might say that my son, my 3-year-old son, is autistic. The risk of naming him autistic is that we begin to focus on him as the center of the problem, right? And so when he throws a tantrum and he's reduced to tears, what's wrong with you? We're reduced to saying, what's wrong with you? Let's try and fix what's happening within you, right? And this is how I was trained as a psychologist, right? But when we start to see that the world is a cripistemology, is a cripontology, and this is from the word crippled, right? That the world is a network of becomings, and that bodies need to borrow other bodies as props in order to use or meet the world at large, that we need other bodies to thrive, and that in certain circumstances, bodies cannot use other bodies, and so they're rendered incapable, like Black bodies in modernity are rendered disabled and incapable as a result of how they appear, right? So they're rendered disabled that way. In a sense, cracks are nodes of disability. They're nodes, they're places where the world cannot contain its vitality. And so it just bleeds, it just spills forth. The decolonial promise of following such spillages is that it promises or allows us potentially to find other ways of being in the world. So grieving is a form of, is a materiality of cracks. Failure is my most championed crack, right? The place where we don't add up, the place where we're inadequate, the places where school says you got an F, right? It's not a stable thing, these cracks. It's just, because I think they're migrant as well. Cracks travel, they're not static. But the places where we are not as good as we think we are becomes, or become, spontaneous occasions for becoming different. I'll put it this way, that when the odds are against us, it's good to remember that the odds work in mysterious ways, right? And sometimes, when you're pressed down into the earth, that is the occasion for freedom beyond freedom. That is the site where we might change form and become different. So I don't know if I've answered your question about cracks. It's usually difficult to think about it in a single linguistic framework. It's poetic, it's effluviant, it's fugitive.
Thank you so much. You perfectly answered my question to you. More than answered my question. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole. We'll move into Casey. And then Selma. Casey.
Good morning or good evening, Dr. Bayo. I don't know what time it is in India. It's nice to see
Casey,
you again.
you're a psychologist, right?
Psychotherapist, yes.
There you go. I remember.
Yes. I admit to losing my question somewhere in your poetry because it, I feel like it was answered 1,000 times over, but I'm gonna try to articulate something that is kind of is present for me. I'm always, it feels like divine timing every time I'm sitting with either you personally or your work, in that, it always seems to land in the midst of my wrestling with something internally where I find myself gripping, and there's an experience of being with you and your work that is just this incredible permission to surrender and to loosen the grip and to be with the uncertainty and to be floating in that space, and not just surrendering to it, but actually like relishing in that space. And you said something in a recent newsletter that you sent, Learning to Limp, that I'd love just to hear you elaborate on, which is, you said, meeting the divine is an adventure in generative incapacitation. And it's, I guess that also brings up the dark night of the soul, right? Like, what is the, you know, in this moment, right, that we're in right now, right, globally, how is this divine incapacitation or generative incapacitation? And you know, if you could elaborate more on your kind of concept of the divine here, that would be
right. Beautiful. Yeah. They're called, I think they're called ziggurats. Ziggurats. I'm referencing the ancient building structures to be found in present day Iran, you know, that is, you know, the progeny of what in the Jewish scriptures, in the Bible, is referred to as the Tower of Babel. Ziggurats, yes. And the Tower of Babel is such a fascinating story about what Einstein bemoaned as doing the same old things, you know, responding within the same old wisdom space that created a problem in the first place, right? So it's like, there's a flood coming. Okay, let's build more. Let's keep on building and let's just keep on doing the same thing and going higher and higher. And then the gods, literally the gods, not just the God. Scriptures say that, you know, they're referred to as the gods. They say, let us go down and pull them down. Literally, one of the few places, I think, where God is associated with pulling people down. Like, I'm not going to build them up. I'm not going to encourage them or whisper kumbaya or hallelujah in their ears. I'm going to pull them down to the ground and confuse them, right? This part of the scriptures is always skipped when pastors spoke to us when I was a kid, because it was scandalous. So I think of incapacitation as a blessing and confusion as a resource. And let me elaborate on that and its relationship with the divine. First of all, I've been part of this world where everything or every problem we come across is an invitation to develop capacity. It's like skill development. Are you having a problem with your spouse? Come to this workshop and gain new skills. So it's about skill development. It's development. It's like this Babylonian principle, building higher and higher. And we're constantly gathering arrows and putting it into our, you know, quiver of arrows, just gathering and gathering like the tortoise in Yoruba folklore, gathering stories and wisdoms into its little calabash. And I wonder, where's the place of breakdown? Where's the place of falling apart? But let me tell a little story that is quite theological in its implications. I feel that in these times, in times of crisis, in times of excessive, and the embarrassing excessiveness that I spoke about a while ago with my sister Nicole, I feel that in these times that God, whatever you might want to call it, is an invitation for us to fall apart. That we make a mistake of thinking of God as singularly the creator, right? Not just, but he's not, he, she, it is not just a creator. There's also a destructive element to creation, right? I grew up thinking about God as a white man. And it's almost inescapable in Pentecostal Nigeria not to think of God as a Gandalfian, you know, bearded figure, you know, definitely white. I mean, if we saw a black God or a black Jesus in our church growing up, I think it would have freaked out everyone, because we wanted to retain a sense of God's otherness. We couldn't imagine God looking like us, right? So God has to be distant, foreign, if you will. He has to look like Chuck Norris or something, or Biden with a beard. Definitely not like us, right? And then we had troubles, you know, thinking about that passage in the Bible where it says, we're made in the image of God. We're made in the image of God. So we started to anthropomorphize about, the aspects of ourselves that cohered with this figure of God. Because we thought of the image as something photographic. And I remember those days, my pastor would say, if you're made in the image of God, then you have God's brilliance, you have God's beautiful face, you have God's this and that. It was a way of attaching ourselves to the divine, as if the divine were another policy statement from the IMF, from the International Monetary Fund, that we should chase after, right? Those were the spiritualities and the theologies that attended my adolescent years. And then sometime as I started to decolonize myself from that, I ran across this beautiful scientific experiment where a man demonstrated that a photograph does more than just represent images. I forget his name. He gave a TED talk about it. I think it's in Stanford University, but he showed, and when I can get his name, I'll share it with you. But that photographs, especially video photographs, capture sounds that you can actually extract sound from images. That is, that images are not just representations. Images are creations of the world, right? We don't take photographs, we make photographs, right? There's a slight difference. No, not a slight difference. There's a huge difference there. And so the image is changing, is what I'm trying to say. The image is no longer a photographic entity. The image is an algorithm. The image is a program. And I think with GIF, is it GIF or GIF? GIF. With GIF images, in these times, in these social network, Facebook times, internet times, we know that images do more than just represent. In fact, we're becoming largely suspicious in the era of what's it called? Deep fakes. Is it called deep fakes? Where Angel could take my face and we don't know who's speaking. Or he could take Obama's face and speak about the audacity of hope or scope or whatever he spoke about and pretend to be others. So it seems that even our faces are not ours, right? The face belongs to ecology. The face has become digital. It has become cybernetic and cyborgian. So where am I going with this? The image is now a program. It took this beautiful theoretician called Ingrid Holozoll to speak about the soft image. And I keep on referring to her work. And she's trying to say basically that the image is not photographic. We're now in the paradigm of the algorithm, of the programmatic. Now that brings me back to my adolescent years, learning about the image of God and this splintering of the image. If God is no longer the static image that I'm supposed to adhere to, an image of righteousness, an image of Gandalfian distance, like the psychologist, the image of expertise, the image of superiority sometimes in different politics of the clinical setting. If God is not just this distant figure, if God is broken, right, and an algorithm, a program, basically, then what does that do? What does that allow me to become, right? And so when I speak about this idea of the divine as something more than just a representation, I am referring to this idea of failure. I'm referring to this idea of things splintering and falling apart as probably the most urgent invocation and conjuring of the sacred. That when things fall apart, God is present in a way that our theologies maybe have not been able to understand, right? That God is present in the falling apart. God is present in the splintering. And there are many passages actually in the Bible that speak about, and I keep on referring to the Bible because that's part of my heritage actually, of God breaking things open. The story of Jacob, I think I told that story in that newsletter, of God breaking, as a form of blessing, breaking Jacob's thigh and blessing him with a new name. And then he had to limp, right? And, it also brings me to notice how the only way to slow down, to notice things differently, is if we're not walking at the same pace, right? So that a punch to the thigh, a breaking open of the bones, almost in some kind of shamanic insistence that we see the world differently, is only effected or affected when something is taken away sacrificially from the wholeness we've assumed, right? So as modern citizens, we're striving for wholeness. We're caught in this Hegelian carceral trap of thinking that the only way to be in the world is to be whole. We're clamoring for completeness. And it's still this paradigm of the image. We don't want a single pixel to be missing in this image of completeness. And that's why we're presenting ourselves through avatars of completeness. Our lives are fine. We're good. Thumbs up. Hey, y'all. I'm not too millennial, so I don't know the words to say, but I'm just trying to say that we present this face. Our social presence is constantly mediated by this invitation to be complete, to fill the boxes that we've been given to fill, right? And so what does God do in that picture? This notion of God, or whatever you want to call it. I think God becomes this introduction of a crack. God becomes the crack in the picture. God becomes the unaccountable rupture, the fault line that disturbs our claims to completion. And that's why I say God loves the fugitive. God loves the fugitive. God meets the fugitive outside the plantation and ministers to the so-called slave that there are other ways, that there's something about where you are that is generous, and I will wash your feet and I will be hospitable to you. And there are many accounts of that. Abraham's slave escaping her servitude, and then God meeting her and bringing a fountain of water out of the desert. I think there's generosity in losing our way, in falling apart. So this is what I mean by generative incapacitation then. It's my way of comforting our anxious souls that if we lose a pixel, that we've lost ourselves. It's what Nico was saying about dying too, right? Dying is a terminal point. But other species, for instance, teach us that dying is something to be celebrated. In fact, you should flaunt death. I think there's this critter, this insect that takes the limbs of other creatures that in its community that have died and ornaments itself, like puts the head. So the insect has many heads on its head, like it's decorating itself with death. Death becomes a practice, an insectoid practice of becoming other than yourself. So generative incapacitation is about falling down to earth. It's about meeting God in the place of fugitivity. It's about saying that losing our way is not as bad as we think. In fact, if we keep to this trope of success, if we keep to this trope of, giving ourselves to the celebrity culture that perpetuates a tautological, assemblage of trying to look like, give me a celebrity name, Paris Hilton, or the next celebrity out there. As we try to do that all the time, the real gift, the benevolent interruption, is the crack that invites us to fall apart. So it brings us back to the conversations we've already been having, the places of failure where we don't add up, where the psychotherapists like you and me, Casey, have been doing our best to help people put themselves back together, put themselves back together again, becomes an opportunity, a shamanic quest, a vision to find other ways of being in the world. That is what I mean by generative incapacitation. That is also what I mean by becoming Black, not becoming an identity, but entering into the luscious, hospitable realms of rupture.
Dr. Bayo, Brother Dr. Bayo, it is always such an honor and such a joy to be with you and be in your company. And I hope that the other people listening to you are as disrupted as I am. because you always magically disrupt my world and my thinking. And that's what's so magical about you. Because as you so teach us, in these disruptions happens openings. And in these openings, we might actually learn something new. So, and I think that's the core of one of the essences of why I love your work. You always disrupt me in a uncomfortable and very important way. So, and I think on that note, and in connection with a lot of what you just talked about, you know, I know I've told you before that I am continuously specializing, I would say, because that is a continuous process, in the phenomena that some scholars have called post-traumatic growth. So as a fellow psychologist, we've always studied the negative consequences of trauma and crises, right? We know so much about that. But more recently, this growing phenomena has become like a bigger research interest. And basically, it is a lot of what you talk about, that what we found is that people, some people who experience adversity and trauma, grow from the experience. Yeah. They learn something that they wouldn't have if not for this adverse experience, if not for this rupture that they might cause us. And I think that's what you talk about in some sense as well, with your cracks and the openings, and how disruptions are a prayer, right? Because they offer us an opportunity to learn something new. So I think my question to you, and I'm still formulating it, and it might just be asking you to evolve or share your thoughts on it, is so in my research and in other colleagues' research, especially one paper I find fascinating, by Ortega Williams, one of Angel's colleagues as well. She found that amongst a group of Black youth organizers in New York City who had all traumas from racism and systemic oppression, those who were able to transform that trauma into efforts of activism, of creating change, that was a direct pathway to experiencing post-traumatic growth. So I think, and then, you know, as a psychologist, we've learned so much that pro-sociality and doing good and doing activism, right, is a pathway to well-being, and it's kind of like this wheel of well-being. But then at the same time, I hear what you talk about, and so I would really like your thoughts on it. This whole balance between doing and not doing in that whole process. And I think it kind of refers back to what you were saying in the very beginning of your talk as well. Because I think so much right now in activism, we talk about doing, right? We have to do something. We have to create a change in the world. And you kind of provoke us in saying, we're in a time of crisis. We need to slow down. So I think there's something really important there that I would just love if you could kind of just share your thoughts on, or evolve a bit, or go into depth with, if that makes sense and if that's clear.
Yeah, I think so. I'll dance with it as well and just respond to what's emerging. I think it was Viktor Frankl that said, if you're feeling depressed or low or something, that go out and build a fence, right? Build a wall. You know, I think with Viktor Frankl, The Road Less Traveled, which is a beautiful book, and he is a Holocaust survivor. And there's something about that speaks to the breaking of the dyadic encounter, right, between the clinician or the psychotherapist and client, right? And this is what Deleuze, you know, Gilles Deleuze and his companion wrote wrote about when they spoke about, taking a walk away from the couch might actually be a more liberating therapy than lying on the couch and receiving psychodynamic intervention. So this idea that healing is everywhere, in a sense, it's ecological, also brings us to notice that trauma is not an experience, right? I think the Western framing of trauma as an experience, or singularly or exclusively experience-based, already is problematized by intergenerational trauma. Because I don't need to experience trauma for me to be traumatized, right? So there's something volatile and atmospheric about trauma that also speaks to this idea of the transmission of emotions, right? That we're not energetically closed selves, right? Where the trauma is within, and then we lapse into conversations about the perpetrator and the victim, which is another problematic binary, right? When we start to see trauma as ecological, as rhizomatic, as more than human, then we notice that even plants and land and places, can be part of traumatic tropes, can be traumatized, and can sustain and rejuvenate and reinforce trauma. So I feel modernity is, for instance, a trauma space. I call it a magosphere, right? I feel modernity is a trauma space, and sometimes the way we respond to it is a trauma response, right? That reinforces its architecture. For instance, activism, and then fight the power. I'm not saying those are bad things, but I'm saying they risk, when we tether ourselves to a narrative of salvation, then we risk seeing ourselves as subjects of the city. And we risk perpetuating the recognizable instead of inching ourselves towards the unknown, right? So this is an expansion of the conversation on trauma beyond the collective, beyond the individual, and towards the planetary. That as a foundation can help me wrestle with your invitation with post-traumatic growth. And I think I mentioned a bit about grieving, as an overwhelming, overwhelming force of nature, not only signaled in tears, but in the waltzing drop of a leaf from a tree and seasonal changes, that the world needs to grieve. The world grieves. And sometimes we need to contain this force, right? Wisdom is knowing where to contain it, where to move forth and back, where to draw the line. The same thing might be said about post-traumatic growth. Yes, traumatic experiences or traumatic events can be occasions for radical forms of creativity. And I think there are historical precedents for that, not just in contemporary moments. The African slaves, the Yoruba people, if they were not pressed to the ground, they would not have created Rastafarian cultures. They would not have created, Candomblé, Santeria, and all the beautiful economic models. They would not have created a Quilombola. They would not have created all those wonderful musical, ethno-musical cultures that we celebrate today. Samba, and for instance, in Brazil. And at the same time, that's not to say that we welcome, we generously welcome the invitation or the experience of being pressed to the earth. It's just noticing that I am not contained within your colonial capture of the victim, that I am more than victim here. That even when the slave master's whip broke open my back, he was undoing himself as well, not just undoing me, right? And so there's just a little aspect that escapes colonial capture that we want to celebrate here, that might enter the conversation about post-traumatic growth, right? Deleuze spoke about this little freedom, right? That there's something that escapes containment. There's something that escapes linguistic capture, that flees away. And maybe that's post-traumatic growth, something that sprouts from adversity. So yes, my work is built around that. That terminology is relatively new to me. In fact, when you mentioned it in an email to me, I was like, oh, there's this wonderful library of concepts around growth from the traumatic experience that I'd like to dive into. So I want to thank you for introducing me to that. And I'm seeing, as I read that concept with some imaginations and decolonial concepts that I've been working with, I see there's room for conversation. That yes, we want to see ourselves as beyond subjects or beyond citizens. That's the only way post-traumatic growth can actually do the work that we want it to do, right? That there's something about us that is not about us, that in a sense we're beside ourselves. We're mad with ecstasy. The Nico is not just Nico. There's something about Nico that Nico's self cannot contain, that escapes the master's whip, that escapes the identity project, that escapes our paradigms of recognition, right? And that is what I think a post-traumatic growth paradigm might help us notice. And yet it's also an invitation to build communities of care, right? To find and create an experiment with new rituals of taking care, you know, not of the citizen subject. Again, that is another relapsing into the same modernistic, self-based anthropocentric systems of therapy we're used to. But now, to take care of Nico, I can go into the world at large. To take care of Nico, I'm already a political being. To take care of Nico, I can pray to a tree, right? That's the breaking open of the dyadic encounter. That's the breaking open of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is at a loss today, right? In the words of James Hillman, we've done therapy for 100 years and nothing has changed because it's been linguistically closed to the therapeutic alliance. Now the therapeutic alliance must spill beyond the clinical setting and must go into the world at large. And that's where I can really meet Nico and Jackie and Barnaby as if for the first time.
Well, what would it mean for us to build the infrastructure for sacred hospitality? What is that? As we've been engaging with Bayo, wrestling with him, we've tried to do that here today. I want to thank everybody who was able to join us, to our fellows. You know, just send prayers to our fellows. You know, they are growing, they are evolving. Send prayers to our program. I leave with just one question that we should all sit with, and for you, Bayo, you can dream on it, have some wonderful dreams, maybe some nightmares if need be. My question, and just for us to end with, is what is the slippery pedagogy that allows us to engage in fugitivity? What is the fugitive-oriented based pedagogy that allows us to sit in the cracks, to explore these new ways of thinking for a world in need of different ways of being, in a way that still remains slippery, as though not to reproduce the paradigms that commodify and trench pedagogical approaches, frameworks, philosophies. So I hope today gave you a glimpse of Bayo's brilliance, but also the power of the Garrison Institute in terms of being a convening force. I'd love to, so thank you, brother. Thank you. Get better. I want your family to get better. You know, you're always welcome back here. And yeah, thank you, brother.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah.